of the content we add to Attack today is coming from members of the community like you, and the reporting that we're adding to Attack and the information is especially in the macOS space, coming from people in this room. So if you've seen Attack, this eye chart is probably the shape that you've seen before. Looks like an Excel spreadsheet. And so this is the Attack for Enterprise matrix. This is covering Windows, Linux, Mac, cloud, containers, network devices, all sorts of stuff mashed together. But what we're really interested in today is Attack for macOS. So we actually saw some tweets come out. Some people are excited that we're finally releasing a macOS matrix. So this has actually been out since 2017. Cody Thomas, who's here in the room, actually led the original development of Attack for macOS. But we haven't really focused in on it, done so much, until Kat joined our team last year. So we're really investing a lot more effort in trying to make it a first-class citizen in Attack. Continuing to zoom in, the way Attack is organized, that it's broken up into tactics. These are the adversary's technical goals. So things like initial access, the adversary's trying to get into your environment, or persistence, the adversary's trying to stay there. Continuing to zoom in, under each of those tactics, we have the core unit of attack, which is techniques. So instead of persistence, we have hijack execution flow, which is how the goals are achieved. And about a year ago, we added one more step to the process, one layer deeper, which is what we call sub-techniques, which is more specific techniques. And this is where we get into a lot of the operating system specific space. So a lot of the macOS specific pieces are found in sort of the sub-techniques. It also means if you're sort of looking at kind of the poster, the flag of the matrix, you might not see so many macOS terms, but start digging into the sub-techniques. And that's where you'll really find the macOS bits. And so instead of hijack execution flow, we have something like dilib hijacking. Going behind each of the techniques, we have a decent amount of information there. We have a text description that is from an adversary's point of view of what's being done here. So what are the technical steps that are actually being taken? Why might an adversary do this? How might it be accomplished? And so information that both red teams and defenders might be able to use to actually look for this or recreate the technique. All of this uses references extensively. And in the case of Attack for macOS, again, a lot of the references are from some fairly familiar people. Each technique has metadata with it. This technique ID, which is where I talk about Attack as a common language. This is what a lot of reporting and other information coming out, a lot of products are now using in order to talk about behaviors in a similar language. What tactic or tactics an attack technique falls under. What platforms, and so this is is it Mac OS, is it Windows, is it Linux? In a lot of cases, a technique can be done in multiple spaces. What data sources would you need to gather as a defender to be able to see this technique? And then various other fields based on which tactic it is. Wherever possible, techniques have procedure examples. And these are examples of how real adversaries have used this technique. So we won't add a technique to Attack unless we've seen some evidence that it's been used in the wild. But that evidence isn't always from places that we can publish. Sometimes it's somebody tapping us on the shoulder saying, yes, this is real. But this is going back to where we've got open source, publicly available threat intelligence, where we can point at it and we can say, this is an example of an adversary using a technique. And again, bringing it to defenders, we give a series of detection ideas that give ways that defenders might be able to actually see this technique being done on their network. And again, some of those detection ideas are coming from very familiar places. And finally, every technique has references. So we actually picked out this particular technique before catching the references on it. But they're Patrick Wardle, Wardle P, Patrick Wardle, And so you start to see some trends in our macOS space, but it's, what we're doing is trying to take the information that you all are putting out and trying to distill it into a form that's usable, hopefully for you and the broader community. Okay.
So this leads us into what makes macOS a special snowflake, which, by the way, it's your own fault for having so many references after you have a book, multiple blogs, like a conference. There's so many. Thank you. If you haven't noticed, thank you all for all of your contributions on this. But for Mac specifically, we've actually hit a lot of them throughout the presentations this morning, right? Notarization, Gatekeeper, these opt-in programs, different developer tools that they can do. I make a joke a lot of times about local admin for everyone, because in a lot of enterprise environments, local admin tends to be a very common theme. Exploitation versus behavior. Over this last year that I've actually been going through the framework, it has been probably one of the key discussions that I've had with individuals in the community and individuals amongst my own team, where is this an exploitation or is this a behavior? And that's probably been the biggest challenge. Like, as we've seen some of the presentations today, it's okay, what defines that example between the two? The biggest thing about the macOS space, the limited reporting. It's a black hole, not only in threat intelligence, but also in the actual development documentation, right? Like, logs. Like, there's actually, I definitely quote some of Sarah Edwards' blogs, because she does a great job of, like, showcasing those logs. Like, there's different authors in here that I will heavily reference in the detection section, because it's the community that's actually creating those resources for us to know what logs to even search for. So a little bit about OceanLotus and why we picked it. It is one of the threat actors that are operating inside of the macOS space that we have in ATT&CK. They've been active since 2012 to present. They're believed to be, based on reporting, the Vietnamese government. They're very big in targeting macOS, Windows, and Android. They're very heavy in the spyware case. Ironically enough, with our keynote speaker, one of the key attacks that they had, which was on the EFF, that was actually what linked FireEye and a Chinese reporting to the same actual actor, which is why you hear like OceanLotus and APT20 or APT32. And then they also have a tendency to target things that are in the Vietnamese interests, manufacturing, hospitality, and then also human rights, or specifically, there's a big word here that I must think of, on outspeaking against the government. So that was kind of the idea. We wanted to be able to take a group that was well represented and then walk through different use cases for this group. So quick note on all the things that we're going to cover. We have the different the different postures of OceanLotus. First is the tree, which is all about seeing things from a different perspective. Then you have the warrior, of course, for all of the threat hunters in the room. Then you have the dancer for adversary emulation. And then you have engineering assessment, where it's the lotus position, where it's like, and Adam will start us off with the next one.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. And so in order to be allowed to talk about cyber threat intelligence, I'm supposed to, I'm not quite sure. Not fast enough for the cameras. So since the people on the live stream aren't actually seeing video, you'll have to imagine that was the best tree pose ever. So I want to focus on three different areas, pulling together a behavioral threat profile on OceanLotus out of attack information. So I'm going to start off with talking about threat intelligence that's in attack itself. So things that we've pulled together from existing open source public threat intelligence reporting compiled that you can directly use out of attack. Leveraging threat intelligence out of external reporting you might be paying for, receiving from sharing partners. And then, especially in this group where a lot of people are looking at raw data, analyzing actual up-close personal threats, a little bit about cyber threat intelligence from your own data. So a piece of attack that we didn't mention before is our group and software pages. So we now track over 100 different threat groups that have been mentioned in various public reporting and over 500 different pieces of software that people have talked about in the wild. And that's across everything. macOS specific is a much smaller subset. So we do call it APT32 in attack. That's because the first report we added to attack was obviously a Mandiant or FireEye report, calling it APT32. Over time, if places are publishing reports that are using other names that describe their view of activity that may be partially or completely overlapping, we'll adopt those names into attacks, our associated group descriptions. So LOTUS and OceanLotus with references back to sources that are saying that these are the same or overlapping groups. Probably the important part, though, for pulling intelligence from this is the techniques. We've gone through a lot of these reports and extracted out what behaviors in attack have we seen from this specific group. And so in the terms of a groups page, it's what have we seen people reporting that an adversary has done hands on keyboard. What has the actor actually done? And the software pages, what is their software capable of doing? And especially in these pages, everything is referenced back to publicly available open source threat intelligence reporting. You can check our work here and see if you agree with us or not, but we definitely show our work in everything we're doing on the groups pages. So backing up to our Mac matrix again. So we do have some techniques that we have on the Otis Solution group page that overlap with attack for Mac. Now, basically all of the reporting we have out right now that we're able to use in attack that we've seen is talking about Windows activities. And so these are Windows actions that are also possible on the Mac. And so I want to zoom out back to the full matrix to start building up the picture. So again, this is going back to definitely sort of the eye chart, but you can at least see the shape of what we're able to gather. So we do have some areas and some types of tactics where we know a lot about what OceanLotus does, and other places where we've got a bit less. But this really doesn't do justice to the full amount of intelligence that is out there on OceanLotus. A considerable amount of the reporting on them, especially in the Mac space, is limited to malware analysis. So we've seen the samples. They probably use them in the wild, or we wouldn't have them in VirusTotal or wherever. And we've been able to associate them back with the group. So if you start taking a look at malware samples that we have and have just been used by OceanLotus in reporting. So they appear to be either written by them, contracted by them, in some ways unique. So this isn't pulling in a few things that they're known to use like Mimikatz. But under the theory that if they've written it, if they've contracted it, probably most of the functionality in there is something that they're likely to have used. So we can add that to the picture that we're building up. So where we see the techniques that we know that they've done in the wild, techniques that we know their software is doing, and just to give an idea of sort of what this is looking like building up in the background of this eye chart, we're starting to fill in a lot of these techniques with black is OceanLotus did it hands on keyboard, green is their software, and purple is both. And so we do sort of build up a much richer picture. This still, though, is only getting at what attack is limited to use. So like I keep saying, we only use open source public threat intelligence reporting to go into this. Well, there's a lot of biases in that data. A lot of the people here blog out of the goodness of their heart, but a lot of the intelligence reports we're able to use are frankly coming out of marketing budgets. There are threats that are interesting for some reason in order to be reported on. They include biases from whoever analyzed it and what techniques they're used to seeing, where their visibility is. And so there are limitations on what kind of data we actually get and are able to use here. That's why it's important to start pulling in your own sources. So a lot of you probably have access to commercial threat intelligence feeds or threat sharing groups, that Slack that people are tossing around information on. And so there's a lot of reporting out there that we can't add to attack that you probably want to analyze as well. So this is a Trend Micro malware report on OceanLotus malware from a couple years back. And it's a fairly small snippet. But if we go through and start to look at the behaviors in just this little bit of a report, with everything from their action with launch daemons, launch agents, getting at system data, all these things actually map back to attack techniques. And so we can go through and start to find one at a time the different activities in this that actually map back to attack. So starting with launch agents, we actually have a launch agent technique, fairly straightforward. Similar story with launch daemon. Rinse, wash, repeat, can go through and add the rest of the reporting here. So how to do that, sort of the process, teaching that is its own course in more time than we really have here today. So I'm not going to really walk through the full process on how to do that. We've worked with DHS CISA to put out a guide fairly recently on how to do this, as well as we've worked with an organization called MITRE Attack Defender to put out completely free training on actually mapping to this type of information. But that's all working with finished reporting. A lot of the people in this room are working with malware samples and seeing actual data, raw data from adversaries that you might want to be able to add into this full picture. So things like internal reporting, pieces of malware on GitHub. A couple of references I had earlier were Mac parts of Empire. Internal in-depth technical reports, things from your honeypots, and direct from binary analysis. So instead of going all the way to Ghidra land, I decided to go with a shell script to make it a little bit easier to read up on the screen. Probably this has been reported in a couple of places before, but this actual example is grabbed directly at a virus total. So again, this may be familiar to a bunch of you given that it has been in reporting. But you can similarly go through and analyze the pieces of this and turn it back into techniques. Starting at the very top, where it is clearly a bash script based on the shebang at the top, which is a Unix shell script in attack. There was a giant base64 here that would have made this slide very, very, very small. So that's been removed for readability, but we would call that obfuscated files or information. They're doing a classic gatekeeper bypass here with xadder. As they go through and they're looking for their files on app translocation, they're doing what we'd call file or directory discovery. Then they're pulling apart that base64 blob with deobfuscating files or information. And finally, they're deleting the evidence. And so this is still just this little snippet, kind of a rich place for behavioral threat intelligence. So I'm going to hand the scepter over to Kat to talk a little bit about what you can do with some of this information.
Back to our warrior's pose, for those of you that are threat hunter. Quick level setting on threat hunter, or threat hunting in general, is talking about the proactive approach to be able to catch what's already slipped through the cracks, right? These are things where it's a proactive, not necessarily a reactive. You're going to search for something that you don't know if it's there. You're hypothesizing if it's there or not. So our Intel team came up with this amazing eye chart that we are going to leverage, specific to OceanLotus. So here's kind of the power behind the community. I was talking with someone else is actually presenting at another conference, and he was telling me about how he goes through and he actually finds ways to scope that data down. Like how does he pick out what he wants to hunt on? And for him, he chooses what does he have in data. And the really cool thing about attack is that what we've done is we've added data sources to the different techniques. What data sources would you find this behavior in? And one way to be able to leverage that is by actually looking at what techniques are covered by what data source. So scoping down, using OceanLotus as our example. When I used to do hunting a lot, I had a friend that he loved auto runs. That was his go-to hunt. It was always gave him the most hits, so that's all he would do. But if you asked him what that meant in macOS, he'd have no idea. And so essentially for us, auto runs is AKA knock knock, but for our block box, sorry. But in this case, it's like we're looking at launch agents and launch daemons, right? For OceanLotus, that is what we have reporting on that they have actually leveraged. So digging into this, the way to, at least the way that I've used attack as a threat hunter was that a lot of times you can't know everything about every single technique. And quite frankly, when I first started working at attack, I thought I knew attack, and I didn't realize, until you're asked to go and create the encyclopedia that everyone else uses as a reference, suddenly you'll realize how much you don't know. And it's a very, very humbling experience. So as I've dug into this and dug into each single sub-technique, there is so much that attack just scratches the surface. So we try to do our best to kind of add to it, but definitely there is more to be seen from it. Regarding the data sources, one project, there's actually a project that I would wish would get taken back up again, which I'll cite later, but they actually go through and they map OS query to the different attack techniques or sub-techniques, which is super helpful in being able to identify, where do I actually look for these behaviors? And again, something that Adam had talked about earlier, is that this is that common language, right? If you're all sitting at the table and you're discussing something, you want to make sure that you're actually talking about the same exact thing. Because being at that table and then not having, then at the end of the conversation realizing you both were referencing something completely different, is very demoralizing time. So one way to also leverage attack, specifically for macOS, is by the procedures that we mentioned before. So these procedures are the actual ways that the malware or the threat actors have actually leveraged this technique. You'll notice the one that's for OceanLotus, it has references right beside it, but also below it for Thief Quest, something that we've kind of been trying to go through and do is adding a bit more specifics into how these techniques are actually leveraged, these procedures are done, just to kind of allow defenders to have a little bit more meat. So you'll kind of notice it's not going to happen all at once, but as we've been going through, we've just been adding a little bit more meat to that. But going off of those references, if you wanted to add additional use cases, that's really where that citing and those reportings come in. So we have a report from Unit 42, we have a report from Trend Micro. These are just the reports that we've been able to leverage and pull into attack to be able to actually showcase these behaviors in the wild. You'll actually be able to pull, okay, for example, the Unit 42 report, they're actually using the applications library to be able to install the plist, whereas the Trend Micro one, they're actually mapping to a completely different location where they drop the binary. So they're just going to give you different use cases and insights to how they're leveraged. Some additional resources for hunting. There is papers that are available for you to leverage. They'll just kind of go more into different ways to hunt techniques, methodologies. Filippo is one of the ones that had worked on the mapping OS query to attack, which is super helpful. Cyber War Dogs has the Threat Hunter Playbook. And then also David Bianco's Threat Hunting Project. Those are kind of some of my go-to resources for anything hunt-related, especially if you're trying to leverage attack. Because again, it's one of those, it is that common language that kind of allows us to traverse all of the tools. My favorite is the dancer, which I can't do in 3-inch wedges, but as far as the red team goes, I thought this was the perfect image for it. Again, going back to the eye chart, Adam made a reference earlier that I think is really significant, and that is kind of that gap analysis. The thing that has been frustrating as going through all of these techniques has been, we have this amazing, incredible analysis that everyone's done on malware, but the moment after that, it's like this black hole. It's what did the actors actually do on the host? What were the commands that were actually run on macOS? We don't have that information in open source reporting. And you all are really the only ones that we can kind of leverage on that. So this is definitely there's opportunities for calls to action here for sure. But the nice thing about having these eye charts is that you can kind of start identifying where are the gaps in the open source intelligence that I have? What do I need to go and dig deeper into? Well, and then starting from there. There's a couple of resources available that are specifically mapped to attack to be able to kind of help you all break, as far as using this as a resource for macOS. One of them, CTID, has come out with different emulation plans, where basically they've worked through different threat actors and then these scenarios with map to attack to be able to execute on a host. Atomic Red Team has great resources where they've actually gone through these procedures and then added a test, essentially red team test, to be able to test those procedures if you have detection. Caldera is also, all of these sources are free. Caldera is also a project that MITRE pushed out, where you can actually use their OS or macOS agent to be able to execute both of these different libraries on, which is kind of nice to have that like kind of already baked in open free project for you to test things out. So walking this through what adversary emulation can, like basically how to leverage macOS attack for adversary emulation. There's a scenario, right? That's a storyline, like who done it, where, the candlestick in the library, that guy. The step where it's going to be the tactic, the sub-second procedure, which is actually what actually happened, and then the objective, what was the overall goal. The way this kind of fits in to the adversary emulations plan, which is what this kind of pretty black and white graphic is of, because that's how CTED has structured their plans, is inside of one step, you have a ton of tactics. And the thing that I didn't realize until I started working at MITRE, or on the attack team, I should say, was we have all these other models for adversary emulation, but the real beauty in attack is that it's like ping pong. You do all, like, you want to do defense evasion in addition to execution, in addition, like, it kind of goes all over the place. It's not this linear progression only. So that's kind of part of the power, right? Like, there'll be initial access, execution, and defense evasion all inside of one step. So again, taking from our wonderful CTI team, where we have this great script that's already laid out for us that we can implement that into our emulation. We can also go further and break it down. So, because that's just one chunk of it, right? Like, there's a whole bunch of other chunks. I was for DEF CON's Blue Team Village. I got the opportunity to serve with like 5 other researchers where we did this macOS threat hunting workshop on OceanLotus. And one of the things that we found was it was really hard to come up with that full picture. And it was kind of neat because working with a whole bunch of other researchers that do everything a different way than you do, and we all think we're right? Like, that's always a fun barrel of laughs. But one of the cool things that kind of came from it was that, like, we all learned different ways to apply attack. And that was amazing. Like, and this was one of those ways where it was like, oh, we all had this common name for it, and this is the technique that it was. And I know this is super tiny print, so that's why I'm explaining this. And then we had the reporting that was mapped to that technique that we were actually specifically leveraging for the emulation. So it was just a really cool way to be able to like gather our resources, know we're talking about the same thing, and then build out that plan. And then this is kind of how it came together, right? For OceanLotus, they used a spear phishing attempt to launch the document, which definitely masqueraded by using the UTF-8 to flip the dot to make it look like it was a document when it was actually an app. And then it would launch the script that Adam pulled down earlier and then broke down into the techniques. And then I left the link up there for the OceanLotus, our hunt. We will eventually release all of that open source, but we're polishing. So if you don't have all of those things, or if you're one of those one-man intel, threat hunting, red teaming, magic magician shops, one of the other ways is by using those resources, those citations, right, those little blue numbers. We've really tried to actually go through all of the descriptions and then actually like provide citations that show you those full commands. This is just one example of Sentinel-1's report where they've kind of gone down and thank you very much for being like in the wild examples. So we've been able to go and like pull all of those different commands and then map them to the right procedures for that actual software, which has been super helpful. Other things that we've also been able to load is as we've gone through and kind of updated things like Gatekeeper, right? There was this great article that the EvilBit produced, and it went over how to use specifically NS create object file image from memory, which actually was leveraged by the Lazarus group for the fileless injection. So it's been kind of cool being able to like pull all of these resources and see how they've all kind of touched each other, and that it's actually execution, but it also provides you the benefit of bypassing Gatekeeper in addition to it.
So finally wanted to take one step back out of the rabbit hole and start pulling all these pieces together. Talk a little bit about leveraging these bits for doing assessment and engineering on an environment. This is where we have our opportunity to actually connect teams. So to take the information that our threat intelligence, our threat hunting, our adversary emulation teams are actually gathering as they look at threats and look at our own environment and pull them together into a bigger picture. This is where we're going to be examining our tools, our documentation, analytics, our processes, and so looking at what is it we're doing today and what are we able to do. So taking a look at our tools, what data sources can we collect? So what have we already implemented out in our environment, and what are we pulling together that it might enable for us? What does our documentation say? What is it that we are saying that we're going to do in response to an adversary? And what do we have for analytics? What is it that we've baked into our different systems for being able to see? And can we see each of these adversary-specific procedures that we know we might need to care about? So starting back with our threat intel picture, and this is just the macOS part of attack, bringing it in a little bit tighter, and this is both the groups and the software. So it's threat intelligence techniques are something we might use as a prioritization for where we really care about adversaries. These are the things that we know an adversary we care about is doing, and so make for a good starting point. We can add in the pieces that our threat hunting team has given us. So what is it that our threat hunting team has been able to see in visibility? What are they able to look into? And it's a notional diagram. This is not a specific network. And we can start to look at where the overlap is between them. What is it that we already detect today that adversaries are doing and we're actually able to hunt for? And something that's really important here is to validate it. So don't just trust, but this becomes a place where the results from our adversary emulation red team are really important. So we said that we see this, we said that it's important. Does the detection actually work? And so it's important to go that one farther step and make sure that what we think we can see matches what we really can see. And so this starts to give us some decisions to make. We've got these gaps, we can see these gaps. Maybe our red team told us we weren't able to see some of these things. So where is it we want to improve? So especially as we look across macOS malware, there's some things we see over and over and over again. Things like command and scripting interpreter, a lot of bash scripts out there. OS credential dumping tends to be important in a lot of different types of operations, and seeing things with gatekeeper bypass. And so seeing those from a threat actor we've prioritized, maybe that's a place that we really want to start, and it's something that we're concerned about. Maybe we look at what we've already got. So we've already got specific types of collection on our end systems. The logs we're already pulling in today. Maybe we're watching stuff with file system activity such that we can see file and directory discovery, or watching things we're able to see browser extensions so that we can pull those in to just add an analytic to use the data we already have. And finally, going back to popular techniques that we see over and over and over again on Mac, launch agent and launch daemon, and sort of watching all things launchd. Maybe there's a lot of bang for our buck there because they're popular techniques. We can get across a lot of bang for our investment. Finally, there might just be things that scare us or scare our board, scare our CISO, that we have to focus on just because of the business impact. So everyone's afraid of ransomware today. For good reasons. The data encrypted for impact might be something we need to focus on, or exploitation of remote services, just because somebody hacking into us from the outside is going to hurt. And then finally, thinking about how to actually fix these issues. Need to be really intentional about improvements. And so the obvious solution, most of us are defenders, most of us have worked elbows deep in different sorts of technical spaces. Technical solution is often the easiest go-to, is often the logical place for us, but it's not always the right answer. So maybe it is a new detection or a new data source. Maybe we need to collect a new log we were missing before. Maybe it's making it so that something's not possible in an environment through a configuration change. But there's also a chance that maybe it's not something that we're going to be able to do anything about. It's a risk that we just need to accept. And of course, going through and trying to validate anything we're doing with adversary emulation. So what do I mean about sort of different sorts of improvements? So instead of just looking at technical improvements, something that I think is probably boring for a lot of us, but maybe phishing in user execution, so people clicking on things, the answer might be more user training. Or if we've got something like hijack execution flow, where our dilib stuff was earlier, maybe we actually need to buy a new tool to do something, see something new. And finally, there may be spaces that we just mark as off limits. So something like supply chain compromise, someone actually inserting hardware into our devices or being able to corrupt our firmware may be too much for us to really consider. And so we may need to actually just accept that risk and move on.
So the key takeaways that we wanted you all to have were this. We wanted you all to be able to kind of have a common language, to be able to talk about all of these, honestly, like typically perceived as very siloed expertise, subject matter expert areas, and then be able to have something to be able to communicate across all of them regarding macOS. I was having a conversation with a friend at lunch, and I think half of my job this year has been finding ways to integrate myself in the intelligence community and integrate myself into the bloggers and red teamers and bring kind of those together where there's just trying to have conversations. And the key comes from, the real takeaway from that is, this is a community-driven resource, right? It's all of the people that have been explaining exploits here and then going over these incredible bypasses. You guys are the ones that let us know what we need to be aware to start updating for, what we need to start targeting. The people that are in the intelligence community specialized in macOS space, you guys are the ones that let us know, is this actually in the wild, and do we need to let other people know about it? Right? Because we're going to use your blogs, and then we're going to use your knowledge of it being actually actively used in the wild, and then combining that so that way we can raise the tide for everybody. And so we're stewards, first and foremost, right? We're not putting out the latest exploit. What we're trying to put out is what's really happening out there, and providing the resources that you guys create to be able to showcase that. And then just be that relevant resource for macOS. So we're really only good as you guys kind of make us. So I would almost throw out there a little bit of a call to action. As for those of you that have definitely been presenting these incredible stories about how you found all of these different ways to leverage these behaviors, let us know on attack. And then we'll try to be there for you and rally and find if it's in the wild or not. And then so you're not alone out there, right? We can definitely start that conversation if you guys reach out. But no matter what, when it comes down to it, we really want Attack to be a place for you to start. If you're getting into security in macOS, or if you're trying to break into a different type of technique, or you're trying to understand something that you really don't know that much about, but you're just gaining insight, we want that to be a relevant source for you all, no matter what. So some helpful resources. There's Medium blogs that we put out. Pretty much all the stuff that we publish out, we try to always do a blog about it, especially with the release notes. You'll notice that the release notes for this time with macOS will have lots of all the updates and changes that we've made to all the techniques. There's other resources that I've already cited before, like David Bianco's threat hunting blog, the Open Threat Research Forge. Katie Nichols did amazing blogs on mapping to attack and getting started with it, for those of you that are not familiar with it. And so that brings us to our questions. We actually have time for questions. We did such a good job. You guys are silent. You're welcome.
Yeah. How much effort is spent keeping all the frameworks aligned with each other? Do they sort of start to diverge, the Windows one, the Mac one, and or do you all sort of convene and make sure if you're going to add a new technique that there's sort of a Windows equivalent or vice versa?
Take take the questions for the live stream? Oh, just repeat. Yeah. Let me make sure I got this right. So how do we basically wrangle all the techniques? Like, is there going to be when we come up with a new technique, is there going to be a Windows equivalent, a Mac one, Linux one, right? Is that basic question? What we found for macOS specifically, right? Like, we found that there's techniques that only really apply to macOS. Same with Windows. What we do is we all have a conversation often together. We all, every single week actually, all of the leads meet, and then we go over, is this a technique? Is this an exploit? Is this a Windows equivalent of this? Does this need to be like underneath a parent technique? Or is this its own special snowflake that we really need to call out and identify as only macOS? So that's kind of how we try to handle it. Like, for every technique that's put out there, we provide a lot of due diligence to make sure that that the research has been done, so you can use it as a resource. Go ahead.
Have you guys done any work in automating unstructured data into ATT&CK? Just doing it at scale is real hard.
Yeah, so the question is, have we done any work into automating unstructured data into ATT&CK? So there was actually some work released a couple hours ago from another part of MITRE working on analyzing unstructured data into ATT&CK called TRAM. So it's a tool that is meant to be a natural language processor to look at processing reports, looking at trying to match up techniques and turn that into attack techniques. And it is absolutely a research space today. So it's, natural language processing by itself is still a fairly nascent field. It turns out a lot of this work ends up being really intelligence analysis. So, first understanding what it is that the report is talking about under the hood, turning that sort of back into a technical technique where it might have a lot of flowery language around it. And that's still a really hard problem for automated analysis. So we're trying to put out the tools for people to be able to test with it, build up training sets, and start to be able to do that. But we haven't really seen a lot of success in the space. And there are actually a number of academic papers out at this point where people have worked on doing analysis into attack techniques. But the recall and precision rates that we've seen so far are not useful in a production environment.
I will say, we, as often as we use our own product, you guys will always use it in a way that we do not expect. Okay, so if there is a way that you're using it and you're like, this is killing me, like, email us and let us know, because we want it to be something that is easy for you to use. Like, that's kind of the point behind it. Like, if you guys are having more frustration than you are, enjoyment's not the best word maybe for it, but if we're gonna go that route, then that's something that we definitely want to know about. Like, someone just told me the other day, they were like, I wish you could just download from the matrix page, essentially a screenshot or a PDF of just the matrix. And I had no idea that that was even a thing. So we don't know that unless you guys tell us. Same with techniques. If you guys want to add a technique or have hey, there's this behavior, email that blurb and start the conversation.
What are your thoughts on the Open Cybersecurity Alliance and all the overlap that exists, what they're doing, and MITRE ATT&CK?
I'm actually not familiar with the work.
Started by IBM and McAfee, it's now owned by OASIS, but their whole thing is interoperability as a common language for all of the threat data so that vendors can communicate with each other in a meaningful way.
It sounds like something definitely to look into. I'm familiar with OASIS and those organizations, certainly.
So, yeah. All right, well, thank you guys so much. And yeah, we cannot be here. Oh, yeah, we do have one thing. So if any of you want to do a tree pose, we have to take a picture of it, but we will give you a flag, an ATT&CK flag, which is kind of a hot commodity, I hear. Yeah, you volunteer? Yeah. Oh my God, I love it. Yes. Yes, that's awesome.
Everyone who wants to come up.
Yeah, anyone that wants to come up. Don't be shy.
Only one flag.
Oh no, there's more than one flag. Oh my God, people are doing it. You guys are amazing.
It's going to be more than we have.
This is awesome. We're gonna have to do first in, first. Yes. This is so great.
Back to a tree pose.
If you guys want to know what a tree pose looks like.
Oh, I thought we were going to get you force this.
Yes, I love it. You guys are awesome. Such great sports. You're great. You're awesome.